Imagine you are 13 years old. Your father has just died. You are now the king of a realm that wants you dead. The men around you, ministers, generals, advisors, are already negotiating with each other. Some of them whisper in back chambers about who should replace you. There's a regent who controls nearly everything. Your mother has taken a lover who is accumulating his own private army, and the other 6 kingdoms surrounding yours are watching, waiting, calculating the moment your weakness becomes their opportunity. You have a throne, but a throne in this world is not power. It is a target. This is where the story actually begins. Not in triumph, not in conquest, but in a room, in a palace, with a boy who already understands one thing more clearly than most adults ever will. The world will destroy you if you give it the chance. Most people who know the name Qin Shi Huang think of a single image: a tyrant who buried scholars alive, burned books, and turned millions of men into quarry dust and tomb brick. And all of that is historically documented. None of it should be minimized. But the story that is almost never told is the story underneath that one. The story of the world before him. The world he came from. The world that shaped the decisions he made. And the world that, because of those decisions, disappeared forever. Because the China that existed before Qin Shi Huang was not simply a weaker version of what came after. It was an entirely different civilization, a different idea of what human society could be. And when it ended completely. The people living through it had no language for what was happening to them, because nothing like it had ever happened before. To understand what was actually lost and what was actually built, you have to start not with the emperor, but with the world he inherited. The world of the warring states. For roughly 250 years before Qin Shi Huang unified China, the territory we now call China was divided into 7 major kingdoms, each with its own laws, its own currency, its own writing system, its own weights and measures, its own aristocratic families, its own philosophical traditions, and its own memory of how the world was supposed to work. These were not simply political divisions the way modern countries have borders. These were genuinely different cultures. A merchant from the state of Chu traveling into the state of Qi would find not just a different language, but different food, different religious rituals, different expectations about how to greet a stranger, different rules about what debts could be forgiven and what crimes were punishable by death. And yet, for all the warfare, for all the burning of cities and the massacre of prisoners, there was something about that era that would never exist again in Chinese history. Something that scholars in later dynasties would look back on with a kind of aching nostalgia, even as they served emperors who had made the old world impossible. There was intellectual freedom of a kind that China would not see again for over 2,000 years. The period is called the 100 Schools of Thought, and the name barely captures how strange and alive it actually was. Philosophers traveled between kingdoms, debating in public squares, being received by kings who genuinely competed to attract the most brilliant minds. Confucius had died roughly 2 centuries before Qin Shi Huang was born. But his disciples and their disciples were still everywhere, arguing, revising, arguing again. Taoists were writing texts that questioned whether any state had the right to govern anyone. Legalists were constructing rigorous theories of how power actually functioned, stripped of all sentiment. Mohists were proposing radical ideas about universal love and the moral obligation to oppose aggressive war. Military theorists were debating the ethics and strategy of conflict. Logicians were constructing arguments that made people's heads hurt in ways they had never experienced before. The courts of the warring states were hiring these people, not just as advisors, as essential infrastructure. A king who wanted to attract capable administrators, talented generals, and effective tax collectors needed philosophers to create the ideological frameworks that made governance possible. Ideas had market value. Intellectual innovation had sponsors. This is the world that produced the boy who would become China's first emperor. He was born around 259 BCE, in circumstances that would later generate centuries of rumor and speculation. His father was a prince of the Qin state, not a particularly important one, hostage to the state of Zhao as part of a diplomatic arrangement, which was entirely common practice at the time. Wealthy kingdoms exchanged royal children like pieces on a game board, each side hoping the hostage would create loyalty between states, or at least hesitation before attacking. His father met a woman in Zhao, a beautiful and accomplished dancer and entertainer named Zhao Ji, owned by a wealthy merchant named Lu Bue. The exact nature of what happened next became one of the most scandalous and disputed questions in Chinese historical writing. Lu Bue, who was a man of extraordinary intelligence and political ambition, apparently arranged for the prince to meet Zhao Ji, and then, according to accounts written generations later, he gave her to the prince, after she was already pregnant with Lu Bue's child. If that story is true, then the man who would become China's first emperor was not of royal blood at all. He was the son of a merchant, a commoner, someone who had no legitimate claim to any throne. We cannot know with certainty. The historical sources are contradictory, and some of the most dramatic accounts were written by people with strong reasons to damage the emperor's reputation. But what we do know is that the rumor existed, that it spread, and that the emperor himself was aware of it. In a civilization where bloodline was the foundation of political legitimacy, this was not a small thing to carry. What we know for certain is this: Lu Bue became one of the most powerful men in the Qin court. He served as chancellor. He wrote or commissioned a massive philosophical encyclopedia called the Lu Shi Chengqiu, the Spring and Autumn Annals of Lu, which was a comprehensive attempt to synthesize the best ideas of all the philosophical schools into a single governing framework. He hung it in the marketplace with gold coins, challenging anyone to add or remove a single word. No one did. He was also, almost certainly, the lover of the young king's mother after she was widowed. When the boy became king, his mother and Lu Bue controlled the court. This is the environment in which the future emperor grew up, surrounded by people whose power depended on his powerlessness, in a palace full of factions, with a mother whose private life was an ongoing source of political scandal, and with whispers following him about whether his blood was even royal. At 21, he performed the coming-of-age ceremony that gave him formal control of the state, and within 3 years, the world around him had shattered in ways that would have destroyed most people. His mother's new lover, a man named Lao Ai, who was apparently installed by Lu Bue as a way of managing the Queen Mother's attention, launched an actual armed rebellion, claiming the throne for one of the Queen Mother's illegitimate children. The rebellion was crushed. Lao Ai was executed by a method reserved for the most extreme traitors. He was torn apart by horse-drawn carts in what the Chinese called the 5 punishments. His entire clan was exterminated. The Queen Mother was placed under house arrest, and her 2 children by Lao Ai were killed personally by the king. Or at least, that is what some sources say. Lu Bue was dismissed from power, and later poisoned himself, or was poisoned, when he was ordered to relocate to a distant region and realized what that order actually meant. The king was 24 years old, and now, for the first time, he was actually in control. What he did next confounds simple moral categories. Because on one hand, the machinery he built to conquer the 6 kingdoms was genuinely horrifying in its scale of violence. On the other hand, the tactics he used were often more psychologically sophisticated than anything the ancient world had seen. He had inherited a state that had already been systematically rebuilt by the reforms of a man named Shang Yang about 150 years earlier. Those reforms had transformed Qin from a relatively backward Western kingdom into something unprecedented. A state where every citizen was ranked in a rigid hierarchy of 17 military grades, and where advancement through those grades was possible only through documented military achievement, specifically through bringing back the severed heads of enemy soldiers. 1 head could raise your family's status. 10 heads could make your children noble. This system had a catastrophic effect on every kingdom that bordered Qin. Because Qin's army was not fighting for loot, or for glory, or for their lord's honor. They were fighting for personal advancement in a system that rewarded killing with illegal precision. A Qin soldier had more incentive to kill than any soldier in any other army, because killing was the only path to a better life for his family. The Qin state had also established a network of mutual surveillance and collective punishment so pervasive that it would feel familiar to anyone who has studied 20th century totalitarian states. Households were organized into groups of 5 families. If one family committed a crime and the other 4 families did not report it, all 5 families were punished. If they reported it, they were rewarded as if they themselves had killed an enemy soldier. This system made trust between neighbors functionally impossible and made the state the only reliable social institution. Qin had also standardized, brutally, systematically, ahead of all the other kingdoms, its weights and measures, its laws, its administrative structure. While the other kingdoms still had complex aristocratic hierarchies where noble families had near autonomous control over their own lands, Qin had replaced noble power with bureaucratic power. Officials served at the pleasure of the king. Land was owned by farmers who paid taxes to the state, not to local lords. This was the machine the young king had inherited. And over the next 17 years, he used it with a methodical patience that is genuinely terrifying to study in detail. He did not simply send armies at the other 6 kingdoms. He hired the best intelligence operators in the ancient world. He spent gold, enormous quantities of gold, bribing the ministers and advisors of enemy kingdoms. One of his chief strategists, a man named Li Si, who would become one of history's most consequential and morally troubling figures, helped develop a systematic approach. Identify the key advisors in each target kingdom, bribe them or turn them into double agents, sow discord between the king and his best generals, spread false rumors, create scandals. Then, when the kingdom was weakened from within, strike. The kingdom of Han fell first, in 230 BCE. It was the smallest and closest, and it had already been so compromised by Qin manipulation that its resistance lasted only months. Then, Zhao, which put up a fierce resistance before falling in 228 BCE. Then Wei, in 225 BCE, taken in a way that should be mentioned with more horror than it usually is. Qin forces diverted 2 rivers to flood the capital city. Hundreds of thousands of people drowned, or starved in the aftermath, or were killed in the siege. The city was simply erased. Chu, the largest kingdom, took 4 years and required a force of 600,000 soldiers, the largest army assembled in the ancient world up to that point. The Chu kingdom had its own deep culture, its own literary tradition, its own shamanic religious practices, completely different from anything in the northern states. When Chu fell, an entire civilization in the most literal sense ceased to exist. Yan fell in 222 BCE. Qi, the last remaining kingdom, surrendered in 221 BCE without significant resistance. Its king had been systematically isolated and deceived for years. His best advisors bribed away. His military alliances destroyed. In the space of 9 years, the world that had existed for centuries was gone. The king of Qin sat in his palace and faced a problem that no human being had ever faced before. He had to invent a new title, because no existing title in Chinese civilization was adequate for what he had become. King was insufficient. The Zhou dynasty had called their ruler the Son of Heaven, Tianzi, but that title was associated with the dynastic system he was explicitly trying to replace. He needed something new. He and his ministers combined 2 ancient words, Huang, a term used for the mythological divine rulers of the ancient past, and Dai, used for the supreme ruler of heaven. He became Huangdi, emperor. He added Qin to the front and declared himself Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of Qin. He then declared that his descendants would rule as the second emperor, third emperor, and so on, until 10,000 generations had passed. His dynasty lasted 15 years, but before it collapsed, he attempted something that the world had never seen: a total reconstruction of human society from the ground up. The 6 conquered kingdoms were abolished. Their royal families were relocated to the Qin capital, a decision that reads as mercy, but was actually control, keeping potential resistance under direct observation. The aristocratic systems of the conquered states were dismantled. Noble titles that had existed for centuries, that defined who a person was, that governed what they could eat and what they could wear, and who they could marry. All of it was simply abolished. Overnight, people who had been nobles were not nobles anymore. The word that described them no longer had legal meaning. This was not just a political change. It was an identity catastrophe. Imagine that everything that defined your family's place in the world, your name, your claim to land, your right to certain rituals, your ability to carry certain weapons, your access to specific markets, was erased by an administrative decree. And then imagine that the government that erased it immediately began demanding that you conform to a new system you had never lived under, with new laws written in a script you could barely read, with new coins you had never handled, with new weights and measures that made your entire lifetime of commercial knowledge suddenly useless. This was the daily reality for millions of people across the newly unified empire. The emperor standardized the script. Before unification, the 6 kingdoms used related but genuinely different writing systems, enough alike that educated people could usually puzzle out each other's texts, but different enough that official documents from Chu might confuse a bureaucrat from Yan. The emperor imposed a single standardized script across the entire empire. This was, in purely technical terms, one of the most consequential administrative decisions in human history. It meant that educated people across a vast territory could read the same documents, creating a shared administrative language that would survive every subsequent dynasty for 2,000 years. Modern Chinese characters are the direct descendant of the script Qin Shi Huang standardized. But in the short term, for the people living through it, it meant that the literature of their kingdoms, the histories, the poetry, the philosophical texts, the records of their ancestors, was now written in a script that the young generation was no longer being taught. An entire civilization's written memory was being made inaccessible. The roads were standardized too. The Qin state had a particular gauge, the distance between the wheels of a cart, and that gauge determined the ruts worn into roads over centuries of use. Roads across the empire were rebuilt to match Qin standards. This sounds trivial. It was not. It meant that agricultural equipment designed for the road systems of Chu would not fit the ruts of the new imperial roads. It meant that the entire infrastructure of daily commerce had to be physically rebuilt or replaced. And the walls began. The Great Wall as it exists today, the dramatic stone fortifications winding across mountain ridges, is largely a Ming Dynasty construction from over 1,000 years after Qin Shi Huang. But the first emperor ordered the connection and extension of existing defensive walls along the northern frontier, creating the prototype of what would become the Great Wall. The forced labor mobilized for this project was staggering. Estimates vary enormously, but hundreds of thousands of men were conscripted. The conditions were lethal. Malnutrition, exposure, exhaustion, and the violence of overseers killed people in numbers that may never be accurately known. Chinese folk tradition preserves stories of the suffering for generations. Stories of men who died building the wall and whose bones were incorporated into it. Of families who walked hundreds of miles to find a husband or son and found only the wall itself. A woman named Meng Jiangnu became one of China's most enduring folk heroines. A figure whose story exists in dozens of versions across 2,000 years of retelling. Her husband was conscripted and died building the wall. She walked to the northern frontier to bring him clothes for the winter. And when she arrived and learned he was dead, she wept so fiercely that a section of the wall crumbled, revealing his bones. The emperor, encountering her, was so struck by her beauty that he tried to make her his concubine. She agreed, and then threw herself into the sea. The story is almost certainly not literally true. But the fact that it was told, retold, and preserved across so many centuries tells us something real about how ordinary people experienced the Qin state. The wall was built with their bodies. The empire was built with their suffering. And the only power left to them was grief. The palace complexes were another dimension of this mobilization. The Afang Palace, begun but never completed, was planned on a scale that modern archaeologists are still struggling to fully document. The main hall alone was reportedly large enough to seat 10,000 people, with the surrounding complex covering an area equivalent to a small modern city. Hundreds of thousands of laborers were working on imperial construction projects simultaneously. The palace, the tomb, the roads, the walls. The tomb is where the story becomes almost impossible to process. Work on Qin Shi Huang's burial complex began when he was 13 years old, the moment he became king of Qin. It continued for the rest of his life. 38 years of construction, the workers numbered, at peak periods, somewhere between 700,000 and over 1 million people. The complex stretches across an area of roughly 98 square kilometers. What was excavated beginning in 1974, the Terracotta Army, is now understood to be one sector of what may be the most elaborate burial complex in human history. There are approximately 8,000 terracotta soldiers, horses, and chariots known so far. Each face is distinct. Each figure was painted in vivid colors that faded over centuries of burial. They were organized in military formation, positioned to guard the emperor in death exactly as a real army would guard him in life. There are bronze weapons among them, real weapons, not symbolic ones, that are still sharp today because of an ancient chromium-based anti-corrosion treatment that European metallurgy would not develop until the 20th century. But the Terracotta Army is the outer ring, the central burial mound, a massive artificial hill that the ancient historian Sima Qian describes in detail, has never been excavated. Modern ground-penetrating radar and soil analysis have confirmed that the mound contains extremely high concentrations of mercury, supporting Sima Qian's account that the tomb contains rivers and seas of mercury to simulate the waterways of the empire. The emperor wanted to rule in death as he had ruled in life, in a perfect replica of the world he had conquered. Sima Qian also records that the craftsmen who built the tomb's inner chambers, who knew its secrets, were sealed inside when construction was complete. The doors were shut with them still working. Their bodies are still there. The emperor was not simply building a tomb. He was constructing a theory of himself, of what kind of being he was and what kind of permanence he deserved. Because alongside the tomb and the palace and the walls and the roads, he was also doing something that reveals a different dimension of his character entirely. He was obsessed with death in a way that was not philosophical, but desperately personal. He was afraid of dying. Profoundly, practically, operationally afraid of dying. He sent expeditions to the islands off the coast. Real expeditions, with ships and hundreds of people, searching for the mythological islands of the immortals, where plants and mushrooms were said to grant eternal life. One expedition, led by a man named Xu Fu, returned and reported that the immortals demanded a tribute of young men and women before they would reveal the secret. The emperor sent them. Xu Fu took 3,000 young men and women onto his ships, sailed east, and never came back. Some Japanese historians believe he and his followers settled in Japan. The emperor also became increasingly paranoid about assassination attempts. And this was not irrational. There had already been multiple attempts. One was nearly successful. A man named Jing Kei, sent by the Prince of Yan, entered the emperor's presence with a map case that concealed a poisoned dagger, came close enough to grab the emperor's sleeve before the assassination failed. The emperor ran around a pillar in his own throne room while his courtiers watched in frozen horror, unable to help because court protocol forbade them from carrying weapons in the emperor's presence. He survived only because a doctor present had the presence of mind to throw his medicine bag at the assassin, giving the emperor a moment to draw his own sword. After that, the emperor stopped making public appearances. He traveled in secret, moving between his many palaces through sealed and guarded covered walkways so that no one outside his immediate entourage knew where he was at any given time. If anyone revealed his location, they were executed along with everyone in proximity. He was the most powerful person on Earth, and he lived like a hunted animal. He began consuming mercury compounds, believing they would extend his life. The mercury was slowly poisoning him. His behavior in his later years, his increasing irrationality, his violent rages, his disconnection from the physical and political realities around him, was partly the symptom of a man being poisoned by his own medicine. He died in 210 BCE on one of his tours of the empire. He was 49 years old. The officials traveling with him, including Li Si and a eunuch named Zhao Gao, who would become one of history's most consequential and destructive political figures, concealed his death. They continued the tour as if the emperor were alive, bringing food to his carriage, receiving his supposed instructions through the closed curtains. The summer heat meant the body began to decompose rapidly. They loaded a cart full of salted fish alongside the imperial carriage to mask the smell. The stench of rotting fish and rotting emperor traveled together across the empire for weeks, while Zhao Gao and Li Si forged imperial decrees. They forged a decree forcing the emperor's heir, a capable and relatively humane prince named Fusu, to commit suicide. They replaced him with a younger, more manageable son, a young man known as the Second Emperor, or Qin Shi Huang, who was so completely dominated by Zhao Gao that he was essentially a puppet from the moment of his coronation. And then everything fell apart. The rebellions began almost immediately. They began not with grand philosophical opposition to tyranny, but with something far more mundane and more human. A group of conscripted laborers, late for their assembly point because of floods, realized that the penalty for lateness was death, but the penalty for rebellion was also death. With nothing left to lose, their leader, a man named Chen Sheng, gave a speech that became one of the most famous in Chinese history, asking a question that has no comfortable answer. Are kings and nobles born different from other people? The Qin Dynasty collapsed 4 years after the first emperor's death. Li Si was executed by the 5 horses method, the same fate as Lao Ai before him. Zhao Gao was killed by the puppet emperor he had made, who then killed himself. The second emperor lasted 3 years. A third emperor lasted 46 days. A new dynasty rose from the chaos, the Han, which would last 400 years, and which would shape Chinese civilization more than any other single dynasty. The Han emperors kept what worked from Qin: the unified territory, the standardized script, the administrative structure, and dismantled what had made Qin unbearable: the extreme surveillance, the collective punishment, the obsessive mobilization of labor, the philosophical uniformity. They also eventually made Confucianism the official state ideology, the same Confucianism that Qin had suppressed, the same scholars that Qin had silenced. And here is where the story touches something that is genuinely difficult to sit with. Many of the things that make Chinese civilization recognizable across 2,000 years of history: the unified territory, the writing system, the idea of a centralized state with a bureaucratic administrative class. These things came from the Qin, from the first emperor, from the same man who burned books and conscripted millions and sealed craftsmen into tombs. The burning of books, the event that history remembers most dramatically as his cultural crime, was specifically targeted at texts on history and philosophy that the emperor's advisors saw as dangerous to centralized authority. Books on medicine, agriculture, and practical arts were not burned, but the historical records of the 6 kingdoms were burned. The texts that gave people an alternative idea of how the world could be organized, many of those were burned. Li Si, who designed this policy, gave a chilling justification. In the past, people used history as a weapon against the present. They would cite precedent to resist innovation. They would point to how things had been done before as a reason not to do things differently now. The burning of books was, in Li Si's logic, an attempt to sever the past from the present, to make the Qin order feel like the only order that had ever existed, or could ever exist. It did not work. The books were memorized. Scholars had hidden copies. The ideas survived. But something else did not survive. The people who had lived in those 6 kingdoms, who had spoken those dialects, followed those rituals, organized their families by those customs, prayed to those local spirits, understood the world through those philosophical frameworks. Those people did not get their world back. They could not go home. The home did not exist anymore. What the first emperor built lasted 15 years. What he destroyed lasted forever. And what is strangest and most human about all of this is that the man at the center of it, the boy who became king at 13, who survived assassination and rebellion, and maternal scandal and rumors about his own blood, never seemed to fully understand what he had done. Not because he was unintelligent. By any historical account, he was extremely intelligent, but because he was operating inside a framework that he could not step outside of. A framework that told him that control was safety, that standardization was strength, that the past was an enemy and the future was conquest. He wanted to be immortal. He wanted his dynasty to last 10,000 generations. He sealed himself inside his own certainty and called it an empire. The soil under his burial mound is still full of mercury. The craftsmen who built his inner tomb are still inside it. The 8,000 soldiers are still standing in their trenches, painted colors that no one has seen for 2,000 years, facing a direction that was once called north and still is. And somewhere beneath the artificial hill, in chambers that no living person has entered, in the middle of rivers and seas made of liquid metal, the first emperor is still waiting for a future that did not come the way he imagined it. The people who lived through what he built did not know they were living through history. They only knew that the world they had been born into was gone, and that the new one demanded things from them that nothing in their memory had prepared them for. They adapted. People always do. They found ways to keep the old things alive in the new containers. The Confucian scholars hid their texts and taught from memory. The regional cultures persisted in dialect and folk religion and daily ritual even when the official world tried to erase them. The families who had lost their noble status found new ways of marking distinction and dignity. They kept going, because that is what people do when history happens to them. They keep going, and they carry what they can, and they leave the rest behind. And if this was the world inside the first unified empire, the fear and the stone soldiers and the mercury rivers, the next question is, strangers to building. What did the people who finally tore it all down believe they were building in its place?
Will we find what we seek, or will the journey transform us?